So before we actually jump into Shakespeare and Hamlet, it's crucial to understand the time period that affected Shakespeare, because it's the time period he lived in, and the time period where his plays were being written and performed and paid for by royalty. So it's important to kind of understand what's happening around Shakespeare in order to interpret his literature. This is known as the historicism way of analyzing literature. It's one of many ways that we can analyze what's happening in literature. But it's important to recognize that all literature happens in a context. Nothing is written in a vacuum. So everything that's happening around an author or in an author's world, in their society, is inevitably going to affect how they write. It's going to affect the philosophies or the understanding of humans. All of that's going to affect the literature. So some more modern examples like Orwell's Animal Farm is very clearly a statement about communist Russia and Stalin. Charles Dickens' novels are directly connected to when he lived, which is during the Industrial Age. Tolkien fought in World War I and was writing during World War II, so the Lord of the Rings trilogy is definitely affected by both of those major events. So understanding the history helps us understand the literature. So what is Shakespeare's historical context? Well, there are three main forces that are at work before Shakespeare is born and are moving in and around England during his lifetime. So the 16th century, you might notice the dates there are not just the 16th century, because technically the 16th century is the 1500s. But in history, we make that 16th century a little bit longer because it starts 1485 with the end of the Wars of the Roses, so the beginning of the Tudors, and it ends in 1603 with the death of Elizabeth I, so the end of the Tudors. So that whole chunk of time we can sort of all encapsulate together in England to say this is one time period, this is one era. So that's one of the key forces at work, is the Tudors, the people who were ruling England at the time, because they ended up putting in some interesting changes that really influences Shakespeare and actually all of history. The other two forces start on the European continent and eventually make their way to England. That is the Renaissance and the Reformation. So I want to look at each of these and kind of how they're going to help us interpret Hamlet. So the Tudors, they're a bizarre family. If you've seen the cable television show, The Tudors, it is fiction. It is not exactly what happened or what we have historical record of. But it does really hint at the idea that the Tudor court or the Tudor families and the way they ruled were pretty flamboyant and at times dangerous. So the first Tudor ruler is Henry VII. He ends up king because he ends successfully on the battlefield the Wars of the Roses. These are multiple wars that have been taking place for over 100 years. Basically two branches of the royal family fighting each other. If you like Game of Thrones, the Wars of the Roses is where the Game of Thrones story originates. It's basically the same story. It's these two families fighting over the rule of the land. In history, the Wars of the Roses, those families are the Lancasters and the Yorks. In Game of Thrones, it's the Lannisters and the Starks. So it's basically the same thing. His son, Henry VIII, becomes king at the age of 18, and he's not married at the time. He's considered like a heartthrob. He's like the most eligible bachelor in all of England. He's incredibly well educated. He's athletic. He's an amazing jouster. He really enjoys tennis, which had developed at this time. In fact, he has a tennis court put into one of his palaces in Hampton. The rest of his education had to do with literature and with music. He was a great musician. There are still pieces of music around that he composed. His desire for power comes out of this very macho, very male way of approaching the kingship. So over the course of his rule, one of the things that we can credit Henry with is the consolidation of power under the king. He's the one who sort of solidifies this idea that the kings are chosen by God, therefore they should rule and the people should obey them. He also accidentally brings the Reformation to England by breaking with the Catholic Church so that he can divorce his first wife. So his desire for power, to solidify his power by having a son, to solidify his power over the church, is really what Henry VIII is all about. So while England had had this really chaotic period in the Wars of the Roses before, now it's having this kind of different chaos under Henry VIII because of all of these shifts he is bringing into the power of the king. So when he does break with the Catholic Church, it's because his first wife, Catherine of Aragon, had a child, a girl, Mary, but had not been able to produce a son who lived beyond infancy. Henry was very, very interested in solidifying his family's rule. Remember, he's all about solidifying power. The Pope, of course, in the Catholic Church doesn't allow for divorce, and so Henry basically says, well, okay then, England isn't even Catholic anymore. We'll make our own church. He did not do this. Keep in mind, he's not doing this for spiritual reasons. He's not doing it because he's a Protestant. In fact, he's a very good Catholic. Earlier than this, the Pope and Henry had been on really good terms. But because he wants to solidify power and he wants to have a son, he breaks with the Catholic Church. This sort of sets a domino effect into effect by allowing Henry to then marry and divorce or kill very quickly all of these different women. So these are the 6 wives of Henry VIII. And here's kind of how they played out. So his first wife, Catherine of Aragon, married for 24 years. It's not like it was just a fling. And actually, she had been married to his older brother named Arthur, who should have been king but had died before their father did. So then when Henry becomes king, he marries his sister-in-law. That's key for understanding Hamlet, because the exact same thing is going to happen at the very beginning of Hamlet. When she does not produce a son, she produces a daughter, Mary. He divorces her, marries Anne Boleyn, who also produces a daughter but no son. This angers Henry, and he accuses her of being a traitor and of incest. He thinks and accuses her of sleeping with her brother and has her executed. He then marries Jane Seymour, who is very much a Protestant and in part of the Reformation. So he's thinking, well, since I'm, not really wanting to be Catholic anymore, marry her. She does produce a son. She gives him his son, Edward. However, she dies shortly thereafter. So the remaining 3 wives, Anne of Cleves, Catherine Howard, and Catherine Parr, don't give him any children at all, and have their various ends that you can see there. Anne of Cleves, he's married to her very briefly. He married her basically sight unseen. He had not even met her. She comes over from Germany. He marries her kind of reluctantly. He doesn't really like her, and they have their marriage annulled. Catherine Howard is Catholic. He's trying to appease the Catholics who are angry that he made England not Catholic. And then his last wife, Catherine Parr, is really the only one smiling in this little illustration because she outlasts Henry. She cares for him in his old age. And in his old age, he is nearly 400 pounds. He's got these ulcers and sores that have grown on his legs, mostly from injuries from his past. And she nurses him through to his death. So taking a look at the Tudor family tree, so there's Henry VII at the top, and the years that he reigned. These are not the years of his life. These are the years that he reigned. Under him, Henry VIII, and you can see his 3 children, Mary, Elizabeth, and Edward. When Henry dies, his son Edward takes over. Edward is only 9 years old when he takes over. So obviously he's not the one making decisions. So when this would happen in British history, the child, whoever it is that is kind of rightfully the heir of the throne, would be surrounded by a bunch of adults. Usually it might include his mother or an uncle or an aunt, and then all kinds of counselors. And they're really the ones who are ruling and making decisions for the country in that child's stead. Edward is a sickly kid. He dies by the time he's 15. So one of his counselors, one of the people in that group of rulers, kind of de facto rulers, has a daughter, Lady Jane Grey, and he really wants her on the throne. And he's loosely related to the Tudors. He's a descendant of Henry VII, just like Edward was. So he makes this case for his daughter, Lady Jane Grey, to be made queen. She doesn't want to be queen, but he forces her to become queen. She's 19 years old. She's put onto the throne for all of 9 days. Because as soon as she ascends to the throne, Henry's oldest daughter, Mary, so notice all this is happening in 1553, Henry's oldest daughter, Mary, goes, hold up, she does not have the same claim to the throne that I do, because I am the direct descendant of Henry VIII and the sister of Edward, who has just died, therefore I should be on the throne. Mary takes the throne and imprisons Lady Jane Grey and eventually orders her to be beheaded. So this poor 19-year-old who never wanted to be queen ends up dying for it. Mary, you can see, rules for 5 years. Her rule is an interesting one. She tries very, very hard to have a child so that she can solidify her grasp on the throne and have an heir, exactly like Henry VIII had, her father. It never works. She has these false pregnancies. It's a really weird sort of medical drama where her belly would swell and people would think she's pregnant and she would think she's pregnant, and like years would pass and she wouldn't have a child. Looking back and looking at some of the medical descriptions, it's likely that she had uterine cancer, but nevertheless dies fairly quickly. So after 5 years, she dies. Elizabeth then takes over the throne. Now, something key to keep in mind about those 3 children. Mary, who is a very, very Catholic queen, wants to bring England back to Catholicism. So remember, her father had broken with the Catholic Church. She wants to come back to Catholicism, so she's horrible to Protestants. She basically hunts them down, has many of them burned at the stake during the 5 years that she's queen. This is where she earns her name, Bloody Mary. When she dies and Elizabeth takes the throne, Elizabeth moves England back to being Protestant. And while she doesn't hunt down Catholics, like her sister had Protestants, she has a really uneasy relationship with the Catholic Church. But she also has spies that are helping keep her safe from the Catholics, because there basically is this open season. The Pope basically says, yeah, if you happen to kill Elizabeth, you probably won't go to hell for it. So there's almost this injunction to try to assassinate her. So she has a lot of spies in the Catholic Church, one of whom is Christopher Marlowe, another author during the time period. Elizabeth is a powerful, powerful ruler. She is definitely her father's daughter. She is very much like Henry VIII in that she consolidates power very rapidly and is certain and very savvy in the way that she keeps that power. She never marries, so she never has to give her power away, which is what would happen with a woman during this time period. They become the property of their husband. And she really starts to address some of these big questions about, well, can women rule? What is the role of gender? And what is the rule to succession of the throne? Who gets the throne after a king dies? Obviously, these are big questions because of how chaotic it was after Henry VIII died. Those are key to understanding Hamlet, because that question of who gets the throne when the king dies is the beginning conflict of that play. So a lot of things were changing in England under the Tudors. There is this sense that the court itself, so Elizabeth especially, and those people around her that made up the court are sort of the center of culture. There is this great interest in theater. Elizabeth loved the theater, so it's growing in ways that it had never grown before. And society is kind of shifting a little bit because there's this increase in literacy. The printing press had been invented around 1440, so there's now this idea that the middle class and the lower classes are growing more educated and they've got more opportunities. Shakespeare is one of those. He is basically a middle class kid who has now a lot of opportunity to get a good education and to move up in the world. And because she loves theater, Elizabeth is also asking for more theater troupes. And so it's this perfect storm, it's this perfect environment for someone like Shakespeare to grow. The other two forces at play I'm going to mention really briefly are the Renaissance and the Reformation. These are both before Shakespeare's life, but he is born into the society that is reaping the benefits or reaping the changes that these two forces bring. Both of these begin on the European continent and eventually make their way to England. The Renaissance begins in Italy, the Reformation begins in Germany. Both of these movements probably never would have gone very far if it hadn't been for the invention of the printing press. Because it is now easy to print books and to get information out to people very quickly, these new ideas, this Renaissance, the Reformation, are able to spread much further than just Italy or just Germany. So first of all, the Renaissance. In a nutshell, there could be an entire semester on just the Renaissance, but in a nutshell, the Renaissance is this very clear period of time where there is this enormous growth in everything that has to do with learning. So literacy, the arts, science, medicine, philosophy, there's this enormous burst of movement and of growth in all of those areas. Again, if it hadn't been for the printing press, that probably wouldn't have happened. Where it begins in Italy, there is this great emphasis on this idea of humanism, meaning that humans, we have power. If we think about things the right way, if we use our reason and we educate our minds the right way, we can change the world. So there is this incredible emphasis on reason, not feelings, not passion, but the mind and reason. This is very much Hamlet. And in fact, his best friend Horatio in the play, he calls a man of reason. When it reaches England, it's this movement that expands education greatly. Well, to boys. Girls aren't really educated much yet at this point. But this is something that Shakespeare himself benefits from. The other movement that begins in Europe and eventually comes across to England is the Reformation. So the Catholic Church had been, well, it is the church. It's not called, anything else. That is the only Christian church in all of Europe. And there had been some pushback against it throughout the centuries, even in England. But the key person in finally creating a break with the Catholic Church, which he did not intend to do, but he did, is Martin Luther, who is a monk, a priest in the church, in the Catholic Church in Germany. He is a little disturbed by what he sees the Catholic Church doing. He sees it as this money-hungry, power-hungry institution and an institution that's very corrupt. In his own study of the Bible, he doesn't see anything in it that tells the church that it can take money from people and that it can become this enormous institution. Instead, he sees that our faith is based upon the individual, that the individual reads the scripture, the individual has faith, and that's really what the church is about. The Catholic Church really didn't like this, so Martin Luther tried very hard to reform. That's where the word Reformation comes from. He tried very much to reform the Catholic Church. He writes this long document made up of 95 thesis statements, basically 95 arguments. He would have fit very well into our class, about what faith should be. And he nails them up on sort of like this public bulletin board or discussion board in the town of Wittenberg on October 31st, 1517. That kind of marks the beginning of the Protestant church. He didn't mean to create Protestant churches, but what he puts into place eventually rolls out into these Protestant churches. So when eventually Henry VIII breaks from the Catholic Church in England, he creates the Church of England, or the Anglican Church, which is still around today, and in the United States is either Anglican or Episcopalian. So when the Reformation then comes to England, Henry VIII creates the Church of England, and he makes himself head. So now he's not only head of the government, he's also head of the church. In other words, ridiculously powerful. He takes command of all of the Catholic churches and all of the monasteries and all of the abbeys where the monks and the nuns live. He basically tells them all to leave, and he takes all of their land and all of their riches. So he becomes enormously wealthy and enormously powerful. Edward, his son, tries to solidify that. His counselors, of course, try to solidify that. Mary comes along and says, nope, we're Catholic again. Elizabeth then comes along and says, nope, we're Protestant again. So there's this interesting tension in England during Shakespeare's life between Catholic and Protestant. We see in Hamlet some interesting Catholic ideas like purgatory, that are sort of introduced in sort of these sideways, very subtle kind of ways. So there's the Renaissance, this emphasis on reason, and then there's also the Reformation. Both are in Hamlet, and they help us understand Hamlet itself. Elizabeth, obviously incredible ruler, and ruled for a very long time for this time period. She ruled for 45 years. So part of what that does is it brings stability to the kingdom. She is well educated, she is very savvy, she understands how to play the game, and because she rules for so long, she brings this great sense of stability to England. This painting is interesting because over her shoulder on the left-hand side you can see all these ships. That's the Spanish Armada that Spain was coming to attack this awful Protestant queen. Spain is very, very Catholic. And in fact, Mary, her sister, had been married to the King of Spain. So Spain does not like Elizabeth. Spain does not like England. So they're coming to attack. And there's this great story around the Spanish Armada that they are destroyed. And you can see that in the picture on the right-hand side over her shoulder. They're destroyed in a horrible storm before they can ever do really any damage at all to England. And Elizabeth takes this, and all of England takes this as a sign from God that she is the rightful ruler. So you can see in the picture just the elegance of her dress. The roses on her dress are both the Lancaster rose and the York roses. She has her hand over the globe. There's a crown sitting next to her. She is queen of the world. She is the rightful queen in the eyes of England. She starts this love of theater, but also love of all things of the arts. And at the time, there's no such role as like the professional writer. You don't like write and then get paid for it by a publisher. That's happened today. But at this time, if you wanted to be an author, a poet, an artist, you had to have a patron, someone who would pay for you to live your life making art. So they would pay your bills, they would pay you for the pieces of art and the poems and the plays that you are creating. And so this patronage system was all centered in the court. So all of the art, the plays, the literature being produced during this time is basically controlled by the wealthy, by the ones who are in the court and around Elizabeth. So there's a great amount of censorship. However, part of what this does is it allows for lower classes, so like middle class men in particular, to make their way in the world. They could, if they appealed enough to one of these wealthy patrons, they could suddenly find themselves being paid quite a bit of money to produce this art. So it's mostly men. There were a few women authors. Elizabeth herself was an incredible poet. So there are some pieces during the Renaissance from women, but in particular in the Elizabethan era here in England, it is men. Shakespeare, of course, benefits from this. And so he is immersed in this world of literature that is appealing to the court, it is appealing to the queen, and it is this very lush, lavish kind of literature. Lots of figures of speech, a lot of imagery, a lot of playing with rhyme and rhythm, and you'll see that in Hamlet. That is the sort of calling card of the Elizabethan literature. So the theater at the time is starting to become professional. Before this, there had been like little traveling groups rolling around the countryside, and they'd move into a town and set up their stage and perform, and people would pay them, and then they'd roll around to the next town. That kind of stops during this period, and instead, because the patrons are paying for it, there are purposely built theaters in London and around other cities as well, but particularly London, where theater troupes would stay. They're not traveling around anymore. They have a theater, they have a home. One of these is Shakespeare's Globe Theater, which was built in 1599. This is after he had become quite famous, first as an actor, then as a writer. And in 1599, the Globe is built. This is what it looks like today. This is a rebuilt Globe Theater. The original one burned down during a performance because they lit off a cannon and it caught on fire. So it's built like a donut. It's open in the middle, and then it's this circle of these balconies where people can sit. That's usually where the wealthy people would sit, and where they could buy tickets they could afford to buy tickets there. The others down on the ground, known as the groundlings, were usually more working class and poor folks who sometimes would barter their way into the theater. Those tickets were much cheaper, and they would just stand there. There are no chairs. And notice the stage itself is quite plain. And that's because, there are no like massive sets. We think of like Broadway and theater today, and there are these very complex sets and changes of scenery. Well, that's obviously not happening here in the Globe Theater. So when you have these passages in Shakespeare where a character is like describing the night, ooh, it is night and it is cold. Well, they needed to. There's nothing on the stage that would tell us that it's nighttime unless a character says it. So that gives you a little bit of a hint into why sometimes Shakespeare is very explanatory. Well, he has to be. He has to give you all these details because there isn't this amazing set. So the theater itself really explodes at this time. Christopher Marlowe, as I mentioned, is another playwright at the time. He's kind of Shakespeare's competition, but Marlowe dies very early. He's only 29 years old whenever he's stabbed in the head, probably because he was a spy for Elizabeth. But yeah, there's really fascinating stories around Christopher Marlowe. So in the 1590s, we see Shakespeare first beginning to write his plays. He had been in the theater. He is listed as an actor in some of the plays before this, but in the 1590s is when he begins to solidify himself as a playwright. In 1599, he starts to move away from comedy, which had been primarily what he was writing. So then he shifts almost totally to tragedy. There are just a couple of plays at the end of his career that are not full-on tragedies. And so we'll take a look next week a little bit at Shakespeare's own life and what happened in his life, what we know happened in his life that also influences his writing.